Bring your awareness to your internal self. This means gathering up all of you to the spiritual. The spiritual is the world of perception. Perception includes thoughts, feelings, sensations. All these together create your spiritual experience. So when we're focused on the senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the skin, we're receiving information from the world of matter, the physical world. In that world, we have a representative called the body. In the world of the spirit, in the world of perception, we receive the information from the senses, and in addition, we have experiences that are distinctly spiritual, like thinking or feeling. Feeling is a mix between the physical and the spiritual. We feel because we perceive a certain feeling, but that feeling resides in our physical body. It's created by physical organs. So feeling is a bridge between the spiritual, the conceptual, and the physical, the world of matter. But feeling is perceived by the spirit in the world of perception. And so, it is a spiritual activity. And all the sensations that get translated from within the body to the brain, all those become spiritual information. And so everything, as far as you're concerned, is spiritual, because even the things coming from the world of matter, even the things reported to you by your senses, are going to be translated into the spiritual language of thought before you can perceive them. So the spiritual world encompasses all worlds. The physical world, the way it can be perceived with the senses, is limited to what we can perceive with our senses. In reality, the physical world and the spiritual world are one. But from our perspective, given that we perceive the spiritual from within, and we have a body that translates to us the experiences of the senses, so we see two worlds. We see two realities simultaneously. The spiritual reality, it would appear to us, that we experience by ourselves. It doesn't seem to be impacted by what others are thinking. But the physical is obvious that we share with everyone else. In reality, even the spiritual is shared. Every thought that we have affects everyone. Every feeling affects everyone, because all of life takes place in a continuous field of energy that is constantly updating all the information based on what's taking place in any corner of reality. Everything comes together to calculate what happens next. And so even though those influences are very subtle and can only be perceived by those who have mastered their spirit, the influences are there, even for the most simple people. They just don't understand how they function, but they're influenced just the same. And so in order to understand the world, in order to understand reality, we need to understand the internal reality. The internal reality is the spiritual reality, the reality of perception, because that reality contains the physical world and all its rules, all its functions. If all we're doing is observing life through the senses, then we cannot comprehend life, because the elements that cause life to be the way that they are not evident to us by our senses. We need to do some calculation, some translation to the mind before we can understand why are things happening in the physical world the way that they're happening. And so the spiritual reality is the all-pervading reality. It's the only reality that's real. The physical reality is how we perceive. So even though we can subjectively agree about the physical reality, about what's there, the physical reality does not indicate why. The physical reality does not indicate the meaning or the purpose. This is something that only the spiritual reality can interpret. So in order to gain a deeper experience, we're trying to go more deeply into the spiritual. To go more deeply means to place more focus more often, so that the intelligence that drives us gains more exposure, becomes more familiar, and then it gains an attraction to what it knows and what it feels comfortable with. So the more time we'll spend focusing internally, focusing on the spiritual, focusing on the world of perception, the more we will become familiar with that world, until we can learn how to find comfort within ourselves. And this will allow us to interact with the world of matter in a way that is most efficient, in a way that doesn't use up our energy, so that we can focus on what's really important, and what's important is inside of us. To become available to yourself by not spending your attention on things that have been observed by the senses. Focus on yourself, on whatever is left of yourself, if you don't consider any information collected by the senses. That's the real you. There's no information that you can collect with the senses that's going to change who you are. Who you are was already created, decided at your birth. You're a human being. What that means is individual to each one of us. It's individual to each moment in our lives. But whatever it means, whatever it is we are, it's not something that can be perceived by the senses. The senses don't carry that kind of information. So in order to become acquainted with this mystery, we must observe for ourselves. And the longer we observe, the more we realize the nature of the senses and how people lose track of themselves because they misunderstand what the senses represent. They lose track of themselves, of the real self, the self that dwells within, the self that is supposed to be served by the senses. And bring all your attention inward. Realize the importance. It's the only thing that's real. The senses create the illusion that what's outside is inside. But in reality, what's outside is outside. What's inside is inside. It's different kinds of information. Learn to distinguish the difference between what's inside of you and what you perceive with the senses. The sacredness of the undefinable and the uselessness of all the different possessions that we can own. Unite yourself within and come to realize that in reality, that's all you care about. Everything else you think you care about is an illusion created by the senses. It doesn't feel the way that it looks. What feels the way that we perceive it is the internal goals. What seems or what looks to be pleasing to the eye is not necessarily pleasing to the heart. So return to having your priorities in order so that you don't disturb your spiritual reality. The reality in the world of matter will be whatever it will be, and we cannot control it, and we weren't meant to. What happens inside of us is us. It becomes us, and then we get to reflect back and try to realize what it really means. So bring yourself back to your source. Bring yourself back to the world of perception, the world of spirit, the world where you decide how you're going to be. And become familiar with that world and the movements within that world that cause you to interact with life. Realize that that's your nature. Your nature is a spiritual nature. You're also in charge of a body. The body has a physical nature. And the body will translate the information from the physical world to the spiritual entity perceiving from within. So unite as that one perceiving. Realize that as your nature.